let's start a warehouse. How hard could it be? Right? And it turns out it's hard enough. It comes with plenty.
Yeah.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavon of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who is it today?
Who is it today? That is a good question. We are talking to Ian Gurekian. He is currently founder and CEO at Avian Inventory Management, which is kind of a parts business. I think they focus on some of the Embraer stuff. But he's got a great background. Before that, he was a chief risk officer with the Macquarie Rotorcraft Leasing, which was basically came from Waypoint Leasing before that. And he was also a senior analyst and head of aviation for Brigade Capital Management. Prior to that, he was VP product evaluation and strategy for G-CAS, and he was also a consultant at SH&E, which is now ICF. He's got an MBA from Concordia University and a Bachelor of Commerce from the International Business from Queen's University. He's always fun to talk to. He knows a lot of stuff, so it'll be a good conversation with him today. So, Ian, this is your time on wing.
Just a quick intermission to pay the bills, then we'll get you back to the podcast. You've probably heard of Visual Approach Analytics. Here's what we do. Visual Approach delivers contrarian data analysis on the commercial aviation industry. Subscribers can start with our industry analysis and weekly insights, and then upgrade to access our downloadable charts and visualize market trends. You can even white label our charts in your own branding. If you need a white paper, a custom presentation with novel contrarian insights for your investors, or your board members, or your boss, yeah, we do that. Our objective is not to be the thought leaders in aviation. Our objective is to give you the tools to be one. VisualApproach.io. Check us out. Okay, back to the show.
Ian, thanks for coming on the show with us. It's always nice to see you, and kind of love to hear a little bit more about kind of your upbringings in aviation and what you guys do today. So, but as we do with all of our guests, we love to hear where the passion came from in aviation. I think you've been doing aviation ever since you started your career, right? So,
Exactly.
Yeah, so that had to come from somewhere. So we'd love to hear about that, and then go from there. So I'll let you take it.
That's great. Thank you, guys. Obviously, good to be here with you. Thanks for having me on. I guess if I look back, I've loved aviation from a very, very young age. My father worked for the Canadian Atomic Energy Association, so from 3 years old onwards, we were traveling the globe as he was constructing nuclear power stations in various countries. All of them kind of interesting at the time. But I guess I started traveling when I was 3, and these were not, local flights. These were, 747s through Narita to Seoul, and, some of the other aircraft down to Argentina and Romania and China. And so I got a lot of airplane time as a young man. So I think that's where it started. That was probably the beginnings. He was a construction manager building the actual nuclear power stations. Right, so this was a Canadian design. Like there's a U.S. design, a German design, etc. But it was a Canadian design, and in addition to building reactors around Canada, they would sell the design and the expertise. And so, you'd have 200-300 Canadians wind up in South Korea in 1975, building reactors on the coast of Korea. And Korea at the time was a very different place than Korea that it is today. Right, it's a very very different. Argentina, even, for example. Like, we were there during the Falkland Wars.
Very different. That's right.
Right, but we had a go bag apparently. So my mom tells me, but there was a go bag at the door just in case we needed to leave.
Yeah.
So
wow,
I find this fascinating, not from the aviation perspective. Garrick, we should start a second podcast called instead of Time on Wing, we'll call it The Time I Spent Glowing, and it'll be like the history of careers in nuclear power.
In nuclear power.
The time I started glowing. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry. Okay, great. So, grow up flying on 747s. These the classics, DC-10s, L-1011s. The second time I've said that today. That's great. So from that early kind of passion to
I think that led ultimately to the classic "I want to be a pilot" thing when you're 10 years old, 15 years old, right? Which I continued to pursue mentally because, as a kid, that's about the only thing that one can do in the aviation industry, right? Is be a pilot, right? Until you start to discover all of the other things that people do. And then, I was even applying to the Royal Military College of Canada, right? To go through and get a pilot's license through them and fly with the Air Force in Canada. And during that process, I got my glasses. It became obvious that I had a need for sight correction. And given that the Canadian Air Force was about, 20 aircraft strong at the time, or 20 F-18 strong, I should say, the likelihood of me flying anything exciting was pretty low. So at that point, I started to pivot a little bit and ended up getting an undergrad in business and then an aviation MBA, right? But there was always that love of aviation. I was always going in that direction in some way, shape, or form. And that's really kind of how it started. So I probably when I was 18 was when the pilot thing went away. And then we opened the door to many, many other things along the way. So.
No, okay. So then, and so your first job was kind of consulting with SH&E. So how did that? How did you go from kind of university in you were Montreal, right? To then because they were based in New York City at that point, right? Or
correct?
So
they were New York based, and I was doing my aviation MBA at Concordia University, and during that process, we had various speakers and people come through, and various research papers that we were reading, and at some point, I saw the name SH&E, so I hadn't been acquainted with it beforehand. But I was also applying to people like Bombardier, right, which were the homegrown kind of favorites. And exiting my MBA, I had a job offer from Bombardier, and I ultimately had a job offer from SH&E. And SH&E was paying double what Bombardier was paying, right?
That checks out.
Coming out of your education, it was a pretty clear choice, but. What I didn't appreciate was that New York was 3 times more expensive than Montreal. And so double didn't go as far in New York City, but it opened up a host of other things for me.
What was the role at Bombardier?
That was fascinating work. Sorry, Courtney?
What was the role that you turned down at Bombardier? Was this on the engineering side? Was it the finance?
It was marketing. It was some sort of marketing strategy role, base entry marketing stuff. This H&E was fascinating. This was a great place to get yourself wet as someone green coming into the industry out of an MBA with no real work experience. Right, I had gone straight into my MBA from my undergrad. SH&E was just a giant learning process, and you saw so much so fast. Within a few months, I got allocated to the privatization and restructuring team at SH&E. A gentleman by the name of Uli Bauer was running that group at the time, who is the father, by the way, of Ron Bauer, right? Who's at Zora right now.
Cool.
He used to be at United Continental.
Yeah.
So I never knew Ron for the longest time, but I knew his father, and we traveled the globe together. And so Uli brought me onto that team, and within my first week, he was off in India, and he told me to meet him in the Ivory Coast. We were working with Air Afrique, and I get to the hotel in Abidjan, and I get a note from the hotel saying Uli's got deli belly. Uli's not coming. Right, he got sick in India, and you're on your own for a week. So that was my intro to the privatization group. I got to go fake it and pretend and get to know the team at Air Afrique in Abidjan, which was classic kind of trial by fire stuff.
Sure, I'd say.
Go figure it out. Go ask your questions. Try not to sound dumb. Get to know them.
But hold on a second. You have no work experience whatsoever at this point, right?
None. Yeah.
And
none.
You show up like the first. Had you met Uli before?
Yeah, I've met Uli before. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So
a couple times at work, but I hadn't actually worked with him yet.
And how long had you been at SH&E, like just in the office in New York?
When that happened?
Yeah.
Like 2 months.
Jeez. Yeah. Wow.
So show up on the Ivory Coast. We'll go meet the customer. Oh, and by the way, I can't make it.
Yeah, and you're there. And by the way, I flew Air Afrique from New York to Abidjan. right? We always flew the client.
Yeah,
so we
right.
get to know the client. And those flights were interesting, let me tell you. Those were not your standard transatlantic flights. So that was it. That was my trial by fire. My first trip was Avian. I wound up back there several times. This time with Uli and the rest of the team. But these were really, really interesting engagements. They were ultimately, I'm going to call them for what they were, a little bit check-the-box exercises on the part of countries that were trying to obtain funding from the World Bank, right?
Yeah.
Plus or minus. Okay, so the World Bank saying, listen, we're going to provide funding to you on various levels, but you need to start showing progress in privatizing some of your things like telecom, energy, and your airline, right? So oftentimes you come into these engagements and the people that are working there and have been working there for a long, long time don't really want you there. They're not the ones that hired you, right? They're going through an exercise. You have to go through the exercise. And sometimes it actually leads somewhere, right? And then a lot of times it doesn't. They've checked the box. But these guys have been working at companies like MEA, right, in Lebanon, right? We got to go back and forth to Beirut and work with the guys at MEA. These are guys that slept on the floor during various wars, protecting their airline in the hangar, right? And you're showing up green, asking them about their operations and their schedules and, what aircraft they're using. And they were operating on a different plane, to use a pun intendedly. But interesting clientele.
Were there any, I don't know, skills, tricks? Did you find a way to kind of break through that? Or is there no breaking through it? You're just the guy that they don't want there?
No, it becomes pretty evident pretty quickly what your role is, and treating them with the respect that they deserve, having worked for so many years building that airline and committed to it in many ways. Asking, it's easy to ask basic questions, right? And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in some of those types of airlines, right, that have never evolved to the levels that the U.S. or European carriers were at the time. And this is like 1999, 2000, 2001. So I think there was ways to help, right? Even with the low-hanging fruit, even knowing that perhaps the ultimate goal of what you were doing wasn't going to result in something. I think they would genuinely get something from our team, not necessarily from me per se, but right. I think we'd walk away, having reviewed all the different facets of their business, what they could change, route structures that they could change, aircraft types that they could change, things that they could avail of. And again, a lot of it was, I'll call it basic, but like stuff that seemed relatively obvious when somebody who's been doing it, like Uli, who used to work for Pan Am, right? Somebody looked at that kind of operation and this, and this, right? And sometimes there's political reasons why it can't happen or it won't happen, or whatever the case was. So I do think that they got something out of it. And then in some cases, you ended up trying to sell a part of it, or the catering part of it, or some part of it. And this was, like I said, that time frame was when people were buying airlines, right? People like Lufthansa and Swiss Air, and this was the acquisition phase where other airlines were associating with other airlines through acquisitive methods.
Did Lufthansa ever exit that stage?
Yeah, good point. Yeah. It definitely slowed down after 9/11 for a while. But,
yeah, fair enough. And that's a good point, too. I mean, around that time, there's a lot of transition right around then when he first started, before, then there was a lot of transition about 10 years later, and then, another 10.
Yeah.
And how long were you with SH&E?
For 4 years. 4 years, till 2004. Yeah. Yeah, and that's all I did the entire time I was there. I plus and minus a few extra projects here and there, but basically that was my focus. And we wound up in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, the Ivory Coast, Cameroon, Cape Verde Islands. Super interesting place, great place to work. Romania with Tarom. These were the airlines that we were working with, and they were all interesting in their own way. They were all kind of fascinating.
Yeah, so how long were you on station? So how long would you travel at a time for gigs like this?
It was, I'd be back in New York for a week, and then in Jeddah for 2 weeks, and then back for 2 weeks, and then in Cameroon for 2 weeks. And it was on, off. It was constant, right? Honestly, I couldn't believe, and I've grown to be able to tolerate it a lot better. But even as a young man at the time, I found that travel schedule brutal. Like it just added up in kind of a bad way over time, right? Like it was, and it wasn't comfy travel. Like you weren't going to a nice place. You know, you were going to places where you couldn't drink the water. You had to be careful about what you eat. There were some security concerns. You had to figure out how to get the internet, right? You'd have to go line up and get a SIM card, right? And put it into your phone. You'd have to figure out how your computer would connect through the hotel phone to get a dial up to London, get the handshake, and download all your emails and stuff like that. So
take notes, kids.
Yeah,
it was harder when we were young.
Yeah, that's right. I had to go up the airplane, both way, like just climb up the steps, and then when you got down, you had to also climb up steps somehow. It was both ways in the snow.
In-flight Wi-Fi. Don't even get me started.
No, that's right. Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, it's very good. It was challenging, but obviously very kind of rewarding. And to this day, I talk about a lot of those experiences.
Yeah,
working in Saudi Arabia. I was ironically safe and sound in Saudi Arabia during 9/11, as 9/11 happened. So just kind of weird locations to be, and, working with the people there, and just so many good people. Right?
Yeah.
So many good, that's the biggest thing.
Were you stuck in Saudi Arabia? I guess it was, about a week before the international travel really kind of came back, or was that just over the period you were supposed to be in Saudi Arabia anyway?
I mean, at that point, it was like, the work was over, and it was time to go home. So we were all just kind of sitting around trying to figure out how to get home.
Yeah, I'll bet.
And as in, like, the work wasn't over, just everything stopped, right? As it did everywhere. And so I think it took 5 days until we could get a flight to London.
Wow.
And then a few days in London, and then I managed to get a flight to Newfoundland on Air Canada because I was going to slowly make my way across, and then from there to Montreal back to New York. So I wasn't rushing per se, but
yeah. So I'm trying to think. So between 2000 and 2004, first of all, what's interesting is both you and I were in New York around that same time frame. I was there from 01 to 04, and then you moved to Connecticut.
Yeah.
With G-CAS, right? And I moved to Connecticut as well in 04.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's beside the point. But so 2000, 2004, I'm trying to think, were mileage programs with airlines like as big of a deal? Like how?
Yeah, they were, and that was the running joke is that everyone's like, "Oh, Ian, you're getting so many miles, like you're worried."
Right.
Like,
I was going to say you're not, right?
On Air Freak.
And, Saudi.
Yeah.
Right. So you had a little bit with everybody, right? But that probably didn't get you anywhere.
It wasn't even like what was I going to do on those airlines, right? So I was the most traveled person with no points on any meaningful airline that I could redeem them on. So
yeah. That's one of those. I mean, that's one of the benefits now, right? Is like people that try to fly with, if you're traveling that much, you want to make sure that you're flying with.
Sure, you know, it opens up. You get a free flight for you and the family down on vacation or whatever the case is. But at the time, I wasn't accumulating much of anything.
Even then, alliances existed. They just were nothing like they would become, right? With the ability. The point being, your miles were useless.
If they had any miles, they were useless.
Right? Yeah.
Nice.
Right.
Yeah. So what made you transition then from SH&E to GECAS? What happened there?
To be honest, a couple points on the personal side, and then kind of one major one just on the professional side. Personally, I had met my now wife, who had also just gotten a job up in Connecticut. So we were starting to look around. Because of her, I was also sensitive to my ridiculous travel schedule, right, which I was almost never home for. And then in addition to that, consulting's a grind, and also you kind of want to end up doing a little bit more as opposed to, we write so many documents, we wrote so many summaries for companies that, check the box with the World Bank. Maybe they did some of it, maybe they didn't, right? And it just felt like I wanted to contribute in a different way, right? And start, quote unquote, doing more as opposed to writing reports and things like that. So those were the three things that made me start looking around. And I didn't really know G-CAS. I didn't know anybody at G-CAS. I just kind of reached out and started trying to push my way in there. And I think it was at a time when they were looking to kind of build out a bit of a segment. I almost became like an internal consultant at GECAS, if you will, right? So I joined the risk side of things. I was doing a lot of different things, right? But ultimately, my role at GECAS was looking at the fleet, looking at the values of aircraft, looking at when we should get into certain types of aircraft, when we should get out of certain types of aircraft, the effects that the NG would have on the classics at the time, right? And when we would expect the values to start dropping on the classics. It was kind of anything and everything. And so it's funny because I still wasn't doing, right? So I wasn't leasing. I wasn't actually like putting leases together myself or trying to work with the airlines to construct a lease. But I was in obviously one of the kind of preeminent leasing companies at the time, right? Between G-CAS and ILFC. And just again, surrounded by some incredible people, some of those, with the classic Irish backgrounds that had been there since inception, and the family tree of leasing, right? As people kind of migrated from company to company and ended up picking up just a lot at GECAS, right? Working for people like Henry Hupschman, who was the CEO at the time, and doing whatever they asked, right? Find out about this, research this. 787 geared turbofans are coming. What's that effect going to have? When's it going to happen? Right? And this is a over $40 billion portfolio at the time. And if you could move the needle a little bit in terms of nudging a corporation like that, then you paid for your salary, and hopefully then some.
I remember. So you were at GECAS from what, 04? How long were you there?
04 to 10.
To 10.
So,
I remember somebody from GECAS yelling from the rooftops, check the powdered metal. Check the powdered metal. Don't trust contaminated. Maybe that was you. I can't remember. But somebody who was responsible for looking into the future of the GTF. No, but what a time to be there, right? Because you mentioned the 787. I do want to put a bookmark in your mention of the transition from the classics to the NG. Because I want to get to Avian, and I really want to hear about that. And then we'll come back to that, because I think there's a lot of really interesting data points and similarities to what we're dealing with
parallels,
today.
yeah.
But you had the 380, right?
Yep.
Which was brand spanking. It entered service right around that time. When was that?
Yeah,
06. I think 06, yeah.
So yeah, what a time! Yeah. What a time to be looking at risk from the leasing perspective.
It's interesting you mentioned the geared turbofan and the powdered metal and whatnot.
You said it. You warned them, didn't you?
No, it wasn't me. It was definitely not me. And I'm not the engineer in the room, and there was also a pretty big differential between G Aviation and GECAS, right?
Oh, yeah, of course.
GECAS obviously focused on leasing and G Aviation on all things technical. But clearly, a big interaction between the two. But it was interesting because when Pratt started to roll that out, there had been kind of a clear history at GE for a long time, having tried it in a prior life, right? That a gear is not going to work. It's just not going to work. It can't handle the stress. It can't handle the repetitive stress, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that they discovered when they tried it, right? And so this became kind of a running Kool-Aid, if you will, through the halls of GE, that this thing wasn't really going to work. And it seemed like such a huge gamble. And hence, some of the decisions that got made eventually. But yeah, it was very much, we couldn't believe they were doing it. We couldn't believe they were committing to it. Everyone at GE was kind of very surprised. I shouldn't speak for everybody at GE, but the GE culture was saying this construct is not going to be successful, and it wasn't, as we know, for the powdered metal reason per se, or I don't know. Somebody was doing it, but it wasn't me.
That's the deep irony of, well, quite frankly, of Pratt & Whitney, right? Because they had similar problems on the Pratt 6000, the Pratt 2000, I think, where the new technology worked. It was the old core
that was failing. Yeah.
That they had the problem. And what's fascinating from the perspective of GE, where I would consider the expertise of GE in the core, right? The composites, but not necessarily in that. I guess you would call it outside the core. So where the gear ultimately would be. But I find that fascinating.
Yeah, no, it was interesting times because people are making multi-billion-dollar decisions around whether you should commit to a certain aircraft type or not, or wait for that aircraft type. Is it going to work? Is it right? Anyway, we all know how that's kind of played out from since then. But yeah, those were the discussions at the time.
Yeah.
And things like 380, we spent a lot of time evaluating the 380. I worked for a gentleman who was very, very intelligent on the technical side and how they design these things, and just looking at the wing on the 380 at the time, and when it was first being kind of introduced as a concept, and this thing's going to grow. There's no way it can just stay at the 800. It's going to be a 900. It's going to be 1,000, right? The wing itself can accommodate way more aircraft, right? But ultimately, the 380, as we all know, was just kind of quote unquote today's technology at the time, or quote unquote old technology, just bigger. Right, so there wasn't real leaps forward aside from just upsizing things and some marginal benefits on the engine. Like that was it, right? So you had to really believe in the trunk root theory, right, and that you could divide by 500 routinely every day, twice a day, whatever the utilization was, and wind up with the right number. So
yeah, what a time! I remember the debates back at that time being. Are we is it more point to point with the 787, or is it going to be hub to hub with the 380? I find it absolutely fascinating that the people who said, this thing was built to be stretched weren't wrong. It was built to be stretched. It doesn't mean it's going to be.
Yeah.
Right? That's where the kind of, I wouldn't call it the financial model, but the demand model fell apart. And the 787, for all its faults, won. And now we're shifting back into the very large aircraft, 777X. We're seeing Dash 1000.
350s. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, everybody's still upsizing, but it's still kind of a point-to-point upsizing, right? As opposed to trunk route upsizing, right?
Yeah.
That was that.
Interesting.
That was the concept at the time. That was the theory. Right? We're going to take 1,000 people between New York and London, and then we're going to distribute, as opposed to 787 style. So, yeah.
Very cool. Okay, from G-CAS to
Brigade.
Brigade.
Yeah, G-CAS to Brigade Capital. So this was when I really wanted to switch, because again, at G-CAS I was still an internal consultant of sorts. Right? Strategy side, this, that, the other. And I wanted to do, right? And it was still this element of doing. And one of the guys I used to work with at G-CAS had left G-CAS and then wound up at Brigade Capital and brought me in to help work on building out the metal side of the portfolio. I'll call it metal. And then the money side of the portfolio, the aviation group was still trading ABS bonds, EETCs, equities, this, that, kind of anything on the quote-unquote money side or the paper side. But we also wanted to start doing some of the metal things where there was an opportunity at the time. So parting out aircraft, right? Taking on engine portfolios and leasing them out through various people. So I switched over to Brigade, and honestly, those were dog years. The team at Brigade couldn't have been better. Nicer. The entire atmosphere was great. I felt massively out of my element though. I was on a trading floor at a credit hedge fund, right, that had decided that they wanted this small, 5-person aviation group to focus on various things. We thought there was a lot of opportunity there, and we did. We did a lot of doing. So that, honestly, that's when I did the most doing, right? That's when you got your hands dirty with legal documents and transactions and underwriting and visiting the part out shops and trading bonds and reading bond issuing papers and everything, right? It was on a daily basis. It was a bit of everything. And it was fascinating. That was probably the point where I learned the most, the fastest, while I was at Brigade. And, so we did almost 100 aircraft, right, for teardown, things from CRJs to 340s at the time, some 747s, a lot of A310s, and some A300s out of American, the classic CF6 story. right? The gift that just keeps on giving and giving and giving to this day. It keeps on giving, right? But we bought an engine portfolio out of the Japan Airlines bankruptcy, and metered that into the market. But all these things, we were the money. We, in the background, we were hopefully semi-intelligent money, but we were ultimately consigning these to, the Abduls of the world at GA Telesis. We were going to Aeroturbine. We were going to AAR. We were going to, Kellstrom. So we weren't physically touching anything, right? They were the ones doing it, right? And we were allocating. And then, listen, a lot of people started getting into that space. It became, I think, in 2009-10, when that had started at Brigade, there were some real opportunities. They were kind of obviously good opportunities at the time. And then a lot of people started to get in on that trade, right? They realized that you could buy these aircraft and make a decent return on the part out. And so more and more money started flowing into those. And what I found ultimately, and you saw it from a lot of the people that did this, was that you'd have an underwriting for a particular aircraft type, right? You'd say, whatever, we're going to make $3 million off this airframe. But it was becoming tighter and tighter in the bid, right, in order to get that airframe. And same thing's happening today. But so instead of just saying, oh, we've got the airframe, now you start to look for opportunities where there was 1 or 2 years of stub lease left. And then some people would underwrite the same airframe at $3 million, which, if you were in that space, you knew was not going to happen, right? It became increasingly difficult to assume you were going to get the same airframe or engine part out underwriting returns at the end of a stub lease, even though on paper it started to look better and better, right? Because obviously you'd have this cash flow for 1, 2, 3 years. And then ultimately, if you take that a step further, I think that's when we really started to see this movement towards what we call middle-aged aircraft, right? Where people say, instead of a stub lease, I've now got 10 more years, and then I've got a part out at the back end, right? We tack that onto the back, and then ultimately it helps underwriting. You can do a lot of transactions that way, but the reality of the part out world is tighter than that, right? It's faster than that.
Yeah.
As an example, if I can, we got 13 CRJ 200s out of the Mesa bankruptcy at the time, and they came with trade claims, right, associated with it, right? I think we bought each CRJ for like $1 million, right? I mean, like, it was how could you lose? How could you lose, right? Whatever happens to the airframe, who cares?
Famous last words.
You had me at Mesa.
Yeah, right. But ultimately, you drop the engines, and like you're gonna, Delta will consume the engines on their CRJs for a while, and then guess what? Like a year later, Delta decided not to operate the CRJ 200s anymore and started retiring them in bulk, and there goes your underwriting, right? So that's how you lose. That's how you can lose on $1 million. Now, luckily, the trade claims ended up being worth something in the market through the recovery, and so that's how that deal did okay, as opposed to being a loss. But it wasn't on the basis of the actual aircraft part out. Yeah. So, and that's where Brigade was really, really interesting, right? Like, you would learn to play both sides of that coin, and you could take something out of a bankruptcy, out of a WTC, right, and make money off of it. You can take aircraft out of an ABS structure and make money off of it while owning the ABS structure, because it was good for both of them. So that was a real learning opportunity for me, right, to be part of that group. But again, as nice as everyone was and as good as they were, trying to do a metal style portfolio in a credit hedge fund, right, is kind of an awkward environment, right? This is a place full of traders who are very, very good at making a couple points on a given day, up or down on whatever the trade is, right? Or taking, long dated positions and things, but not in metal, right? Not in the aircraft industry per se. And so
if I could just real quickly, were your team members at Brigade aviation people working in a credit firm, or were they more credit people working on the aviation team? Like, did they filter back through the other parts, or did they go on to other aviation roles?
Truthfully, it was just kind of two of us originally that, had GCAS background.
Oh, okay.
And so we kind of started building it out. And as we did, we added on an accountant, a junior analyst who's gone on to great things, but was focused on kind of equity trading, right? The equity side of the business and equity trading. And then somebody who I'm working with today, who's Doug Ingram, who's joined Avian as well. But we hired him on to help us manage all of these hard out transactions we were doing and dealing with all of the various people who were doing the quote unquote dirty work, right? Like the dirty thumbprint stuff. Huh.
So, and how long were you with Brigade?
Also 4 years.
Also 4 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so then I want to know what transitioned you to all of a sudden go from that to, I'm going to play with helicopters for a while.
Yeah.
That's pretty different.
That is really different. And,
yeah.
And that also was an incredible learning experience. But, ultimately, like I mentioned, Brigade was very focused on kind of the credit side of things. The aviation platform in terms of metal, I think, had kind of run its course. There were other people getting into it. And Waypoint came across my plate. And it was very, very interesting to me because here you had effectively a startup leasing company, but in a different segment of the aviation space, whereby hopefully you could apply a lot of the, what I'll call low-hanging fruit or lessons learned in the commercial aircraft side to the helicopter side and build out a substantial leasing platform. So this was almost from the ground up, right? I joined the team, I don't know that they were a year into the whole thing, right? When I joined as chief risk officer, but it was an opportunity to start and build a leasing platform, hopefully applying all of these lessons, right? From G-CAS, from bond trading, from credit analysis, from all these things, right? Because the helicopter space was not, Milestone was in already, right? So Milestone was always like the obvious number one, and we were kind of the clear number two, right? For quite a while. But there was a lot of opportunity there. Like leasing wasn't really a thing in the helicopter space. And here you had these oil and gas helicopters, which were $30 million, $35 million machines, right? That, why not, right? Like why wouldn't you lease these types of things to these companies like Bristow and CHC and all the other operators in the world. But we ended up learning a lot. I still to this day, for those that don't know, ultimately Waypoint went Chapter 11 in 2018. So, and there's kind of a lot that built up to that sort of thing. But to this day, I would still do it the same, if you will. I think we had a really good team. I think we did a lot of things right. I think we got caught by a couple things like the price of oil declining substantially in 2014, 2015, right? Which meant that the oil companies that did all of this back and forth out to rigs and exploration and development slowed down their activities massively, which then had a pretty substantial effect on CHC helicopters, who we were heavily exposed to because we were a small company trying to get bigger quickly, right? So you start to take these outsized risk chunks on, and you're overexposed, but you can do it properly over 12 years, or you can take your bets, right, and try and do it a little bit quickly in 1, 2, 3 years, right? And that was clearly the plan. So we had all this exposure to CHC. They went Chapter 11. We were heavily exposed to the capital markets, right? So we had kind of a different funding structure, and we managed those very well for a while. But then ultimately we just started coming up against covenants, and the whole thing started to unwind. Like, there's only so many places you can put an S92, right? The oil company, you can't incentivize people to take a helicopter at a cheaper price, as you kind of can in the aircraft space, right? In the commercial aircraft space. With a cheaper aircraft, you can retire something else. You can open up new routes. You can experiment. All the things that one can do with it. But if you're Bristow, like, I don't want your S92. If I don't have a contract with Shell or Petrobras or whatever it is, like, don't sit it over here. I don't care what the price is. It just costs me a lot of money. So it became increasingly difficult to place those assets in the market and find homes for them. And that's ultimately what, asset not on lease, you start breaking that covenant, and then that ties to the other thing, and you reshuffle some things. And
So the helicopter leases were with third-party operators that would then, they were probably not charter, but more like ACMI for the oil companies ish.
Yeah, basically, they were contracted by all the oil companies to perform a specific operation, right? So it was weird from a credit perspective because you'd have someone like CHC who was mediocre on a credit basis, but then the underlying contracts that these aircraft flew on were for Shell and Total and this and that, who are all, kind of stellar credits from that perspective. And the cost of the helicopter operation was so de minimis relative to the multi-billion-dollar oil exploration of that particular platform. So when you looked at it, you said, this is insignificant to them. They would literally have 2 or 3 S-92s just sitting around all week doing nothing, right? And because they were dedicated to a particular base.
Sure.
And, the aircraft might go out and drop a person off or a part off or something like that. And then on the weekend, when everyone wanted to switch, right, then they would transition the crews from their 2-week on, 2-week off rotation and be super busy for like 6 hours, right? And then these $30 million machines would sit around doing a lot of nothing for a while. And it was difficult to make them more efficient because you can't they're not all coming back to a hub at night, right? You're not running a hub operation
right.
From both a maintenance perspective and a passenger utilization perspective, right? Some days you would want an S-92, other days you would want a small 169, but you can't have that. You can't bring the other aircraft in and out to these remote locations and hubs, right? So it's complicated. It was a complicated industry, and it required a lot of money for assets to do very specific functions, without perhaps the economic justification, right? For them it's like, well, listen, we need to get people back and forth. We could do it by boat. It takes longer, or it's dangerous. So we'd rather do it by helicopter. And pre-2014, the oil companies didn't care, right? The cost was basically, quote unquote, not an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then
I remember that. How people were saying, like, it doesn't, as long as you have a contract, doesn't matter what the cost is.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think the contracts were more like cost plus, right? Similar to,
correct.
I think some of the regional stuff, right? It's like, so it didn't really matter. Yeah.
What were the terms on these contracts? Were these like 2-year terms? Were they 8, 10? Did they align with the leases?
Long, but you'd have you'd see average 5-year terms on them. And then the assumption was that they would just continue, right? Like
and they just didn't. They just weren't renewed. Got it.
Right.
Yeah. Now, were you? I'm trying to
fell apart quickly.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Was it the EC 225, right? That had that grounding.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Were you guys involved with that? Did you have exposure to that?
Yeah. Well, we had exposure because we had 6 225s. Right. Some of them we already owned and were on lease, and some of them were yet to deliver from Airbus. And again, these are $35 million machines that overnight became paperweights. And it was interesting to me at the time because I kept saying, if you compare it to the commercial space, there's not many examples of an aircraft type being grounded at the time, right?
Hold my beer.
Famous last words,
Right. Something would happen, they'd investigate, they'd correct it, but you didn't ground the whole fleet, right? You didn't render something useless overnight, right? So as an investor, that was kind of a new concept, right, with an asset this expensive. And ultimately, I think in the aviation or the commercial aircraft space, the people who are flying are making the decisions, whether they're informed or not informed as to whether they want to get on an aircraft, or they don't care, or they don't know, right? But when a 225 crashes twice in a row, the oil companies that hire them say, nope, not that one anymore. Thanks, right? Our crews don't fly on 225s anymore, right? And that was kind of the knee-jerk correct response from a lot of them at the time. So you then had an aircraft that was useless, right?
So
it was doing nothing.
The second crash, according to Wikipedia, so if we don't like it, we can change it. June 2nd, 2016. So the timing matters here. So June 2nd, this is all in 2016. The emergency AD came out, I think in July. Between June and... No, I'm sorry. It was in June. So the emergency AD came out. That grounding was lifted in October of 2016. And the context of this, by the way, the DC-10 grounding was, I think, similar in length. And then consider the MAX in the context of like what we thought aircraft groundings were.
Yes. So the difference is that on the DC-10, for example, when you lifted the grounding, it then went back to work.
Yeah.
Whereas with the 225, Airbus lifted the grounding because they decided it was fine, but the industry did not. Yeah.
Oh, the order was lifted by EASA. Interesting. So FAA issued the. Oh no, EASA issued the emergency EAD. Okay, I'm sorry.
So then those aircraft they sat around for a long time, right? What's interesting though is that the 225 in its military variant flies for a lot of countries and performs, I would expect, at torque levels and stress levels that far exceed the commercial operations, and they've generally been fine. But there were 2 incidents, right, on the commercial side, and then that was that, right? So that was a good example. To come back to your, you're right. It ultimately ended up playing out similarly again with the MAX now, right? And to me, that was the first iteration, the real iteration, where they said, "Stop!" Right? Everything's grounded. We're gonna investigate this. It's gonna take some time, and it was debatable when, the MAX would come back ultimately.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
As
an investor, how do you account for that? Right?
Yeah, right. That's a huge investment that all of a sudden you're like, by the way, it's a total write-off. We can't do anything with it.
If you're a risk officer at any company like that, there's no amount of capital allocation that you can allocate to cover yourself for that kind of incident across a big fleet, or for that matter, something like COVID, right? Like if you went into any boardroom and said, "Listen, we need to allocate X amount of capital for the possibility that a third of our fleet becomes grounded and useless," right? You wouldn't be able to operate, right? You wouldn't be able to operate. So
it's an interesting hedge, though. I wonder if there's a play there for a much larger firm, because what I find fascinating is what ultimately doomed the sector was low oil prices, which is a boon to commercial aviation, right?
Yes,
so it's positive. So there's a counter-cyclical or a hedgy aspect to that, but you're right. I mean, it's black swan, right? I mean, or gray swan, if you would. That's interesting.
What was interesting to us was that we were the ones educating the commercial market about helicopters, right? So we were taking to the banks. We were explaining to the banks, right, what the value retention profile of a helicopter is, which, by the way, is very similar to an aircraft engine, right? You have all these parts that are constantly replaced over time, right, with new parts, and so long as there's a need for it, then the value either is retained and sometimes even appreciates, because you're just constantly replacing this thing of parts with ever increasingly expensive parts, which are controlled by the manufacturers like Sikorsky and Leonardo. And so the value retention profile of helicopters is very good, right? And that story still holds today, if you can get past the potential for some sort of fleet grounding. But that was what got us, was that we were heavily exposed to the oil and gas market, because in order to grow a small company bigger, you had to put dollars to work, right? And the only thing that you put dollars to work on was an S92, a 225, a 139. Eventually the 189 came out, things like that. But if you were going to try and do it with little kind of bug smasher EMS stuff, right, that takes a lot of EMS helicopters at anywhere from $3 to $5 million, right, to build a portfolio, right, and a lot of touch points. So hence the desire to try and allocate on a risk basis, but ultimately the cause of our failure at the time. Yeah.
I mean, if you think about the helicopter market, it's probably, I don't know this, you know this, Ian, but I would assume it's oil and gas, EMS, and law enforcement.
There's some of that, but that's not the main. Utility is probably the other category.
Oh, interesting. Okay, very interesting.
So into in and out of mines.
Yep.
Right, like reason you're dropping people off near mines, things like that are hard to reach. Forestry.
Search and rescue. Yeah.
And then the other thing that wasn't quite true, right? Although we hoped it would be true, was that you could take a helicopter that was doing oil and gas, and if there was no need for it there, that you could convert it easily to an EMS operation, right?
Why
or some
not?
other utility operation. Because all of the oil companies had their own specs for a particular helicopter, right? So a helicopter that was operating in Indonesia had certain air conditioning specs and LiDAR specs and this and that. Like the whole thing got so hyper over-spec'd, right, that you'd put all this money into it, and then you turn around, the EMS guy would be like, oh, I don't need any of that crap.
Yeah.
Like, take it all out, it's just heavy. I need to put in beds and oxygen and this and that and like extra, and you'd be taking the whole thing apart. And the amount of like, it's kind of like when we talk about aircraft and taking out the in-flight entertainment system on a 380, right, and converting it. Like it's a lot of investment when you're transitioning something like that, which is why, a 320, right, in simple configuration, goes a long way every time you try and transition it. But that never played out the way we hoped it might, even though that was part of the story, right? The transition from segment to segment was almost, I would say almost never, but almost never.
Yeah, because that is always a kind of selling point. Selling point
Yeah.
with helicopters, like, oh, you could do all these different things, right? But at the end of the day, that's
and
fine.
technically you can, but economically it's not a good, it's just a bad decision.
Are those specs?
Right.
The specs seem more integral into the aircraft systems and design, as opposed to like galley position that we think of, or even like IFE or seats. Like, that's expensive on a 380, but okay, pull them out, put different seats in, or put hospital beds or whatever. Yeah. Yes, you can. It's the cost of the bed and the seats, but like if you're dealing with, hover time or air conditioning or whatever.
It's integrated into the avionics. It's
a
system of the aircraft. Like it's extensive. The changes were extensive in some cases, right? And then in other cases you could take an oil and gas helicopter and go have it be a utility helicopter. You just have a bunch of people sitting in seats. That's fine, right? So in some cases that works, but sometimes it'd just be overspec'd. And now you kind of have an expensive helicopter for a utility role. But if it was sitting around doing nothing, you started to do that. Then
you're probably assuming. I mean, you mentioned earlier you've got the value retention, sometimes even appreciation. That's probably baked in. So that's like assumed in the deal. So if you're basically ignoring the value specs of this oil and gas specialist helicopter by putting seats in it, well, you don't retain the value from that.
Correct. And sometimes you have to break it out, right? You'd have kind of a 2-segment value appraisal in that you'd have the underlying base helicopter, right, that you would assume has a relatively stable depreciation curve. And then you would take the special spec stuff for a particular client and depreciate it over 5 years on the contract.
You writing this down, Garrick?
Taking notes. That's why I don't do helicopters.
We're going to rip it all out, right? And then it would be garbage, right? But the next guy who wanted EMS didn't want your oil and gas stuff.
This makes a ton of sense. Like the connection to me is obvious from SH&E GECAS, but the part side on the credit, this, and then to Avian. I'm sure I'm missing a gap in there, but the single point of similarity, you just really have to know your shit, like the details, know what that part is, what it's going to do, where the value is, where it's not. I find this all fascinating. So fill in the gap, because I really want to get to Avian.
Yeah, no, sure. Ultimately, we did a few transactions while I was at Brigade with a particular OEM that were ultimately kind of the idea, right, that transpired to create Avian. Okay, so they were the basis for something that percolated in my mind while I was at Waypoint, right, and was kind of building, and it just became obvious to me that there was more to do in that space, and that space ultimately is providing capital solutions around inventory. All right, now would I've had the guts to start it had our Chapter 11 not happened at Waypoint, right? Probably not. However, right, there's nothing like a Chapter 11 to kind of push you off the ledge and find the best time to go try something, and that was it. So I transitioned to Avian. I started Avian in 2020, and that was it, right? So going out to the OEMs, looking for opportunities. That was my first point of contact, and because that's what we had done, right? That was one of the transactions we had done at Brigade. And so I was reaching out at the time to people like Leonardo, right, who I just left contact with from my helicopter days, and Sikorsky and whatnot. But then also started broadening the search, and ultimately ended up talking to people like Bombardier, and then ultimately Embraer, who Bombardier was my first client, and then Embraer was my first big client. But really what Avian does is provide a capital solution around inventory. So the world became very, very comfortable financing aircraft, right? We saw that and we've seen it, and it just continues to flow into that space at ever narrowing margins, from what I can tell. The world then became comfortable with engines, right? And okay, I get it. These are big, expensive things. They're kind of replenished, right? Over time, they're rebuilt over time. I see that value curve. I then took that story to helicopters, which had a similar kind of asset value retention curve, right? And now in my mind, the next step is inventory, right? And so that's what Avian's doing, is ultimately looking at pools of inventory, helping OEMs, MROs, airlines, anybody, you name it, right, that has a bespoke capital requirement, right? Whether it's on the supply side of things, whether it's on the surplus side of things, whether they have other things to do with their capital, as opposed to having inventory sit on a shelf, right? And in today's world, you literally have billions and billions of dollars of inventory sitting on shelves. And it's just not the most efficient, best use of an airline's capital to do that. It's not the most efficient way to distribute that inventory to people, right? Everybody has their own pile sitting on their own shelf somewhere just in case, right? This notion of pools that the OEMs have created is all around inventory efficiency, because these are like the helicopter parts. These are extremely expensive parts. Everybody knows that in the space, and
what's more expensive than those parts is an airplane sitting on the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of money there. There's a lot of money tied up in inventory, and Avian works with, like I said, anyone and everyone. We're agnostic. We don't care what your inventory is. We have a solution for it, right? We'll work with you to either move it to market, or you tell us how you'd like to move it to market. Or you tell us how you're going to consume it, right, later on. Or you tell us what you need us to buy so that you can consume it, right, and help diminish working capital times, right? Working capital in general, and turn times on their inventory. This is what we're playing with now. And so in many ways, I take a lot of what I learned, for example, in the helicopter days, where we were going out and educating people around the helicopters, right? This is the value. This is the value retention. This is what a value curve looks like on a helicopter. And now saying the same thing around inventory. So this is the pool of inventory. This is, what it looks like. This is the ultimate market that consumes it. Right? This is the aircraft type in the background that's consuming it, that will likely not retire for the next 15 years. Hence, if you have a bunch of rotables, right, and if the new price of inventory keeps going up, which it traditionally does, right, then your used inventory is at a discount to new inventory, right? And so it starts to rhyme, right? All these things, the financial curves start to rhyme with one another, and you can hopefully tell that story, right, across the board. So that's what Avian's doing. Roughly speaking, that's what Avian's doing.
How big is the company today in terms? So you started in 2020. Here we are in 26.
Yeah.
What have you done with the last 6 years,
The
Ian?
first year was a lot of me sitting around staring at myself during COVID.
Yeah, well, in fairness, we were all doing that.
Yeah. Like nothing better than launching your own company and then not traveling and not doing anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Sending a lot of emails and hoping people would reply. But so I'll be honest, when I first started it, the intent was to do what I'll call a lot of paper transactions. So I hope to, through my investors, sit at my desk and do these things without ever touching the metal and doing it that way. There's a lot of ways that you can leave inventory where it is, or transition it to people who have the capabilities to touch the metal. But it was obvious that a lot of companies didn't want to do that, right? So it was difficult for them to retain their inventory while also selling it. They needed to move it. And in the case of like Embraer, who was basically selling down all of their surplus material, they literally wanted it off their shelf and they wanted it off their balance sheet. And so, we joke about it internally at Avian all the time, but we sat there saying, well, all right, let's start a warehouse. How hard could it be? Right? And it turns out it's hard enough. It comes with plenty.
Yeah.
It comes with plenty of hair on it. And, the daily operation, the daily grind is real. But now we have what I will call world-class distribution center in Orlando, staffed with 45 people. Daily operations with AOG coverage, and anybody that comes to see it says, A, it's a warehouse, but B, this looks excellent. You guys have done a good job standing this up in the first 2 years. We did it in 2 years, and we've now been kind of quote unquote operational for 2 years. Is how it's worked out. So we're a 45 person team in Orlando, and I bounce myself back and forth between New York and Orlando, and now New York and Brisbane, because we've just opened a small, what I'll call satellite office in Brisbane as well, or a distribution center in Brisbane.
So yeah. Garrick, if you're keeping score, I too started my company in 2020 with one person. 2026, Ian now has 45 in a warehouse. I have one person and a podcast studio that moonlights as a guest bedroom.
Some days, Courtney, you're better off for it. It's funny. Like you start something like a warehouse, and all of a sudden your email's full of which forklift do we buy, right? And all these things that you weren't really planning on thinking about. And people issues and, AS 9120 certifications on an annual basis and meeting Embraer quality standards and having their QA. I mean, it's a real operation all of a sudden with a bunch of people who I was lucky to come across and hire who had a lot of experience doing that type of thing, right? So I'm certainly not the smartest person in the warehouse. That's for sure. There's a lot of people that know how to do that.
So I guess we're talking to the wrong person. Too, we're talking to the wrong person, apparently.
Yeah.
No, now see the difference. I am the smartest person in my company. I also happen to be the stupidest guy in my company.
That's the strategy, right, Courtney? You're the only one. You're the smartest one.
Yeah, that's right. You kind of fit all those brackets. So just to make sure I understand. So ultimately, when you guys are, you look at sort of like the relationship you have with Embraer, where ultimately they were looking to offload some inventory. So is the relationship where, you bought them at a certain price with the agreement that it also is being used to be able to support Embraer and their customers? And so there's a relationship there where, that it basically you're managing their stuff ultimately to be able to support their customers. And so that's where the benefit is, or is it just purely we bought the inventory and now we're selling it to other people, and if Embraer needs it, yes, that's one thing, but it's all on us basically.
Yes and no, a little bit of both.
Okay.
Embraer ultimately looked at what they had and said, listen, we want to clean up our own shelves, if you will, right? Over the years, we've accumulated, they order in quantity for production of a certain aircraft, and they wind up with 10 extra, widgets sitting on the shelf, and they said, we will retain what they call their minimum, right? Which is ultimately everything they need for production, for pool, for supporting a customer directly, for insurance purposes, right? Anything where they're generally speaking contractually kind of obligated to have material on hand, they retained. But then anything above that was quote unquote surplus, right? In some way, shape, or form, right? Whether it had sat on a shelf for a long time or they just had too many of it. And so they're very good at what they do, right? They're engineering-wise, they're spectacular. Boeing steals a lot of their engineers, for that matter, right down in San Jose dos Campos. But what they didn't want to do was sit around answering 1,000 phone calls a day from a bunch of brokers trying to buy parts cheaply, right? They're just not. That's not where they're going to make their money. Mm-hmm. That's not what they're set up for. That's not their strength. So they said, listen, what can we do to get this off, right? And become efficient about doing that. How can we monetize this inventory? And ultimately the conversation went, we said, listen, we're going to take it. We're going to monetize it. We're going to sell it to the market. we've created this sales channel partner concept where we have multiple parties that are selling the parts for us into the market. And also Embraer knows where they are, right? If they want to come back and buy them, or, they need them for a customer or whatever, then they can see it. They come get it. They buy it back from us. It hasn't gone away, right? It hasn't disappeared on them. And, we talk to them almost daily, right? So whether it's a matter of getting the right paperwork sorted for a part, getting things cleaned up so that it's fit for sale, or just them calling and checking to see if we still have a particular part on the shelf. But ultimately, the goal is to monetize it, right? To sell the surplus into the market. Let us be the people that answer the phone 1,000 times a day, right? To move the parts so that they can focus on what they do best.
So you're dealing with both new and used parts, or is this only the stuff that's coming from the OEM, brand new?
So in the Embraer case, 90% of that inventory was new, right? Okay. So it was coming to us new. Like I said, they kind of ordered a lot of that from various suppliers to do their production over the years. And this is across commercial aircraft, business jet aircraft, right? Their 120s, everything, right?
Oh, okay.
Basically all their commercial platforms. So we effectively deal in the new stuff. We deal in USM. Some of that material came to us used, right? And in addition to that, we've also done some work with, for example, Azora, right? Where we purchased aircraft for part out. But I'm not out pounding the pavement looking for aircraft to part out. If there's a reason, if there's a play, if there's something that we can do with somebody, right, then we'll do it. But I already had the basis to take on some 170s and a 190 from Azora and part them out and add them to the box, right? So we had the expertise, we had the basis to do it. If somebody wants to consign things to me, great, but I'm not in the part out business. That's not what I do. Like, I don't run around looking for part outs. And if it comes up, fine. If it's strategic, that's fine. But that's not the bread and butter of what we do, right? The bread and butter of what we do is really kind of a wholesale inventory capital solution around your widget, whatever it may be. New, used, new from a supplier that you want to then buy from me. It takes the form of supply chain finance, right? To a certain degree. You can think of it sometimes as factoring, but it's ultimately being hopefully a more efficient use of capital, right, around inventory, and opening up some breathing room for some of these companies.
Yeah. Now, was there a specific reason why you looked at the regional space, or was it just they answered the emails, or were you looking at a specific space?
No. Again, I can't. I'm incredibly grateful for my relationship with Embraer, but I do struggle in trying to communicate that we are open to everything, right? So it just happened that way. Bombardier happened to be one of my first phone calls. Again, like the home team advantage and my Montreal connections, and started talking to them. And
on the commercial side, or was this
business side?
Yeah.
Yep. And so it was smaller packages of inventory. It was a few aircraft, again, kind of on tear down, with the hopes that Bombardier might ultimately consume some of that material in their service centers, and otherwise we'll move it to market. And then I think I came across Embraer's path or plate at a time when they needed it, or when they were thinking about it, right? And this was when they were in the middle of dividing the company so that their commercial unit would be sold to Boeing, and they would retain their executive jet side of the business and everything else, right? So in their minds, they had a solution through Boeing for their inventory and their aircraft. And then ultimately, I was crossing their path at the time when that was starting to fall apart, right? As we know, during COVID and whatnot. So once that happened, all of a sudden the pool became much bigger, right? The opportunity set for me became much bigger, and it was no longer just around the remaining executive jet inventory, but it also took the form of, hey, why don't we just bear hug the whole thing and try and come up with a holistic solution around all of it? And that's what we do. So. But now my focus is not on the regional space, and I'd really like to say that as many times as I can. But it's just the funny thing though is that like once you start, it kind of one thing begets the other, right? And you're in that space, and then all of a sudden you're parting out 190s and 170s, and then you're selling engines, and then because we have all of that material, we then became associated with Alliance Airlines in Australia, and so the story continues on the embryo side.
Yeah, but what you lose in typecasting, if you will, you gain in scale, right? So I mean, the company's growing, even if you're looking for that Airbus and Boeing kind of entry or addition to the warehouse. I mean, things are moving, and just that scale itself brings those opportunities, right? I have to think.
And we've got 3 things in the pipeline for this year. None of them are regional focused, cool. Right? And so hopefully we can get close to announcing those in the next few months, but none of those are regional focused, right? Which is part of that story that I'm.
Yeah, it's
not only
great.
a story, but an actual practice to do.
Yeah,
it takes time. I've learned that it takes time.
Have you found that what you guys are doing is how competitive of an environment is it? Because as we've talked about, since the start of all of our careers, right, it feels like, everybody starts for one point and it's like, oh, you know what, aircraft leasing, and we're focused on this and this. And then people go, engines are great, let's focus on that. And then, midlife airplanes, and then parts. And, it feels like, as time progresses, people just look for different opportunities where they can, get a better return. And so it kind of pushes them into the different things that maybe are slightly more risky or more complicated. Or so in the 6 years that you've been doing this, are you finding that, your environment is getting more competitive, or do you still feel like, hey, you know what, we've got a pretty good handle on what we're doing, and so we're still in a good position from that standpoint?
The risk of enticing others into my space.
Yeah, right. How do you answer that? It's a
the returns are terrible. Don't do it.
I wouldn't come close to this space if I were far away. Truth be told, there's not a lot of people doing what we're doing. I think the way one should envision it is that, it's a Venn diagram where there's a lot of really capable people who are vendors and distributors and part out companies and do all of that. And then on the other circle is full of financiers who have a lot of capital and who want to deploy a lot of capital. But there's very, very few people, I think, with that small overlay in the middle, where you have the financial experience, you have the financial structuring experience, right? The understanding of the assets as collateral in the background, and the ability to actually touch metal, right? We have a distribution center. I don't want to say it's secondary, but it's kind of secondary to what we're doing, right? It's an enabler that enables us to do the main thing, which is a structured financial solution. And so I think genuinely there's not a lot of people quote unquote kind of competing in the space. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of people that bring the same skill set to the table in a discussion. And ability to source the capital, ability to tell the story, ability to educate the right people that want to be educated around that, and then perform, right? And then actually do it. Physically do it yourself, as opposed to outsource it to another party, which of course is what we did during the Brigade days, right? Like to the GE Telesys and Aero Turbines and AARs, and those guys are great. They're amazing. They're a lot of what I look up to, but
I'm noticing a trend.
Attack it from a different angle.
The trend I'm noticing through your career is just getting your hands dirtier and dirtier.
That's true.
Right? Touching more and more metal.
Yeah. I'll be on the ramp before you know it. But
hey, man, that's all. You know what? I wouldn't put it past you because I don't know. I don't mean to speak out of turn here, but Avian seems like a great addition to some large companies. Yeah, I could see you retiring at the age of, I don't know, what are you, like 32, something stupid like that. And working the ramp because you didn't have anything else to do. Because I do think there's just a lot of value that, it's one of those things where you can look like from where Garrick and I sit and be like, there's just a ton of value in the stuff that you do. But no, there's no way for us or really anybody else to get from here to there, right? It really took that combination of experience, willingness to open a warehouse and just do all these weird things to follow the path.
Right. Yeah.
It's been a massive learning experience. It's also been highly humbling, right? In that you think, I agree with you, Courtney, by the way, right? Like I must agree with you because I believe there was an opportunity set that I wanted to take advantage of. I think what has struck me is how difficult it is to get in front of the right people,
Sure,
to educate them around what the product is, right? And to get in front of them often enough, right? Where when they do need you, then they think of you, okay? Because this is not a full-time necessity. Like I've approached people years ago that told me to bugger off, like they had zero use for me, who now 3 years later have a use for me, right? So you kind of need to perpetually tell the story so that on the day that they do need you, that the phone call comes in and you can start structuring things. So it's interesting because there's been these kind of waves, right, in terms of who needs you when, right? Like my example with Embraer is not that they needed me, but they were in the middle of trying to sort stuff out, right? And that was the right time, right place. Right now it's different entities that we're working with for different reasons. And but yeah, it's just it's like telling that story, getting in front of people. Avian who? What do you do?
yeah.
Like when you're not GE, people don't pick up the phone as quickly, right? They don't answer emails as quickly.
We were just talking about that.
We were just talking about
that.
Yeah.
When you're with a big company, an OEM, a big leasing company, people pick up airlines, right? People pick up the phone. As soon as you leave, you're somewhere else. People are like, I'll get back to you someday. I'll see you next time.
What do you do?
Yeah, that's right.
Is your challenge kind of on the sales side? Is it more convincing customers to use you, or is it more convincing them that this solution is something they should consider? Not necessarily your solution, just the idea of the I don't want to call it consignment, but capitalizing and monetizing.
Yeah. I think it's more the latter, right, Courtney? It's more the latter than it is the former.
Sure.
But also, like when I walk into an opportunity or a room, whatever you want to call it, I don't know what your problem is, right? I don't know what you're trying to solve for, and generally people are pretty cagey about telling you what their problems are. So you kind of have to throw a few darts at the board, hoping that one sounds, we could do something like that. Oh, let's talk about that, right? Open it up. And then if you happen to be in the room with the CFO and not the guy who manages the inventory, then you lose half the equation, right? Mm-hmm. You either have to convince them both at the company, or you have to convince multiple different departments that feed in, right? Or you convince all of them, but the CFO's not convinced, right? So there's a lot of layers to the storytelling, and finding the right people at each of these groups that kind of see it for what it is, understand the financial engineering behind it, right? And it's not just a margin game, right? It's not what we're not just buying something for 95 cents and selling it for $1, right? That's not what we're doing. It's more complicated than that. Right?
75 cents on the dollar, I get it.
then we're in business.
But it's I mean it's the true form of relationship, right? Which isn't just, hey, I know you, we had a great dinner the other night. It's the credibility level of, like you said, you go and you talk to somebody, they're like, we don't need this, and 3 years later, out of the blue, you get a call.
Correct.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Right. And just quite frankly, like I have a tendency to revert back to my analyst days, right? And want to, to analyze things and sit behind something and write an email. But that's my uncomfort zone, where I need to get out in front of people to be able to better tell the story, to make those relationships, to get, to continuously be on the road and tell the story.
You fake it so well.
I know, because people are the worst.
My computer, so,
yeah. we all say hiding behind our computers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it's definitely very telling for I think the success that you've gotten by the fact that you've got this. You haven't fallen into the part out game in terms of because I could see how you would get a lot of pressure in terms of to get more inventory, why don't we just buy assets and part them out ourselves, right? Which is something that, from what I understand, you clearly avoid doing that. You're purely looking for, we're trying to create a solution for somebody that has an inventory, and that's what we're looking for. Not, hey, let's go find and bid on these assets, with 20 other people just so that we can create inventory for us to sell, right? And I think that's what, to me, differentiates you from a lot of the other folks out there. But it's also going to be very tough to keep that going because, like you say, you got to have the right conversation at the right moment for the right so it's got to be challenging from that standpoint of, having that pressure of like, well, why don't we just do what these other guys are doing?
Yeah, we're set up for it. Just do it, right?
Right.
Now, I've been trying to convince people that we're a great consignment shop if they want to do that because we're already set up for it, right? So as far as I'm concerned, like I've got. By the way, the structure is that like we have this operation in Orlando and we have 5 sales channel partners that we've hired, and I call it their embassy, but it's like their people, their computer, their desk on my soil, and so they come and they each have a line. And those five sales channel partners have exclusive access to the material that's in my box, right? So even me as a distributor to the world, like I don't call airlines, they do, right? They're the ones that call the MRO shops. I have 5 customers. I sell to my sales channel partners, and then they distribute to the world. And they also call, trying to collect and do all the AR. Mm-hmm. But it's symbiotic in that they don't have to put any capital up to acquire inventory.
Right.
I mean, they have their own, right? I mean, these are like well-respected companies that do their own thing. So this is just kind of additive to them, right? To a certain degree. But this box was set up for that reason, right? Around the Embraer inventory. And if I can layer on things like strategic part outs or other things in that particular box, then we'll do it. The alliance thing in Australia, like I didn't sit down and decide, hey, I want to strategically get myself into Australia. That was a conversation that just kind of happened. And lo and behold, like, fine, you want us to set something up like that there for that purpose? Fine, we'll do it. Let's go do it.
Yeah.
And the truth is the next box might be completely different, right? And different, build to purpose. What do you want us to do? How do you want us to do it? How much of it is there, right? Are we talking about volumes? Are we talking about, multiple clients? If it's Dubai, if it's Germany, if it's, wherever, Japan, it's fine with me. Like we'll do that all day long. You tell me how high to jump, and so long as the numbers work, we'll do it.
Yeah.
But that's where it's coming from. But you're right. I'm not out chasing part outs. It's hard to get enough of those, I suppose. We all know it's a good business if you know what you're doing. Some people are very, very good at it. But it's hard to replicate that on a recurring basis and not have your margins get hit because, as you stated, you've got 20 people bidding on, every asset that pops up, and there's not enough of them that have popped up recently because people are generally using these things, right?
Yeah.
We haven't had a wholesale sale of used assets.
No, not yet. It's still holding strong.
We thought it would come during COVID, but it didn't.
Yeah.
What about bidding on inventories at bankrupt airlines or something to that effect? Is that something that you've done, or maybe just the opportunities haven't come up?
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, Courtney. I haven't done that sort of thing. Also, I like to retain a connection with the seller, right? If that makes sense. So I want them to have a connection to how it works out. I want them to have an interest. I want them to want to see their own inventory, right? Not their own, but once they sell it, to be able to buy it back, right? It's in my best interest. This is my risk management, hat going back on, saying, I don't really want to just buy something from you and walk away and never talk to you again. Like, if I need help from you in recreating the paperwork for a particular part, I want you to still want to do that, right? Yeah. So a scenario like you just mentioned, where I'm just buying potential. What's the show where people just go buy a storage unit? They don't know what's in it.
Yeah, storage wars.
They hope for the best. Sometimes it's gold. Sometimes
I just got a great idea for a new business model. You can only see the airplane from a distance, right?
You want it or not?
Yeah, there it is. That's right. You could see that it's got 2 engines.
Well, maybe
they should be there.
Well, they'll have engine covers over them. You just don't know if there's the core inside it.
So it could be an engine. It could just be a bunch of boxes. You don't know.
Bid. Go for it.
Yeah, that'd be a great show.
But I do see I see us accelerating right now. I forget how you were phrasing the question before, Derek, but I see more people interested in it, and I kind of see it accelerating at this point. I'm fighting less for the opportunities to explain.
Is that purely just education?
Yeah, I think so. You know, look, listen, we've done XYZ with so and so, right? We've done these three things. Does it sound like something you'd want to get into? Yes, no, and like everything, you go down 10 opportunities and maybe one, you know, actually kind of follows through and becomes real. But yeah, there's more and more of those conversations. So I feel this only gaining in size at this point. And hopefully it's a combination of financial paper transactions and then other things where we have to set up other boxes or use our box differently.
Yeah. Well, we're right about the 1 hour and a half mark.
Awesome.
You know,
wow,
surely enough, right? Which tells you how great the conversation was.
No, but, we're gonna have to have Ian back on.
Edit it way down. Oh, you want
all the things. No.
Go ahead, next week after that.
Yeah,
no.
Yeah. What are you doing? Just because there's so much to talk about as well. But this is fascinating for me.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely, and it's a very different. You know, it's not like you're just talking to, you know, some of the parts guys, right? Or it's a very different business model from all of that, which is what makes it so interesting, right? And I'm sure, as you keep going forward, right? Like you say, as people understand what you're able to provide as a solution, right? Then as time comes for, you know, depending on what's going on in the industry or region or whatever, I think that's where all of a sudden that conversation changes, right? And it's all of a sudden like, you know what, that will work for us because we can get some money out of it. Yet we know we have access to the parts because we know we can buy them if we need them, like all these things, right?
Each one of these are constructed entirely differently.
Yeah.
Right? Every single one, right? And it just involves you telling me what you need, what you want it to look like, and then seeing if we can make something fit. Yeah. Right? And so each one of these has its own, you know, its own bend to it, which does make it really interesting. And I love it. I love it. It's been hard, but it's been a lot of fun. It's been challenging. Like I said, it's been super humbling, especially at the beginning. And every day you get weird emails about which forklift to buy and which what's things like that. So.
Yeah, very cool. Well, hey, Ian, thank you very much for coming on and talking to us. We always love chatting with you, so this was definitely a pleasure to do. And we'll definitely have you back on at some point to see how much you've grown. And what else you're doing, right? All of a sudden you can be like, hey, you know what? We got big into the A380s. We're like, whoo, it's just, we went all in. How
many parts those have?
That's the opportunity set, boys. Go big.
That's right. Go big or go home. And that's the way to go big.
Yeah. Alan, I really appreciate you having me on as well. This was fun. It's always great to kind of talk it out. And you never take a moment to stop and talk through the entire arc of how you got here. And it's a little bit cathartic to do as well at the same time. So But it's always fun seeing you both.